47% of our population is under the age of 15. Our working population is actually at about 25-30%. And then we have the aging population. That working population is feeling that squeeze because they have to take care of the 47%, and they also have to take care of the aging population. So in the US, we call this the sandwich generation, and we feel it here very strongly because it's so heavy, especially on the child care part.
One of the great transformations of our time is demographic change. In much of the world, the population is aging rapidly. In other parts of the world, we have very low median age, high fertility rates. This means that we're living through a real transition in the care economy. Who needs care? Who's delivering care? Where care is being delivered and where it will be delivered. Africa is positioned to lead a care revolution, so says my guest, Blessing Adesiyan. She is the founder and chief care officer of Caring Africa. I'm Joe Waters, and this is Per Capita. Blessing, welcome to Per Capita. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. Super excited to be here.
I want to begin the conversation with your home country, Nigeria, which already has more births than all of Europe combined, and the total population of Nigeria is on pace to surpass the United States later this century, and it will become the third largest country in population in the world, which means there, among other things, that there is an explosion of care, particularly for the young, happening in Nigeria. So how are you and those you work with as the chief care officer and founder of Caring Africa thinking about the opportunity to support care, especially as the population needing care, particularly in the earliest years? We'll talk about aging in just a few minutes, but that population of young children needing care is growing so rapidly.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. This is one of my favorite conversations to have, especially because Nigeria is on track to be the third most populous country in the world by 2040, behind India and China. And so this is no longer a drill. We actually do need sustainable care infrastructure to support, like you said, the growing population, the high fertility and high birth rate in this country. And we're not only seeing this in Nigeria, we're also seeing it across Africa. In terms of, what we are doing and how we are thinking about, this explosion of birth, I think two things stand out. I think one, it is that the urgency for care is here. We are already way past the support that families do need in order to access quality, affordable, and accessible care. The other key issue that we're paying attention to is how highly informal and highly, unregulated care is in Nigeria and across major parts of Africa, where the care workers or the care workforce, if you will, is actually not prepared to support the growing population. And we are seeing that this is putting a strain on the economy. It's putting a strain on families. It's putting a strain on the community because the community is also becoming increasingly westernized. And what I mean by that is that the community is no longer as communal as it used to be. It used to be that in Africa or in Nigeria, your parents can watch your children. The village is there to support your family, to support this new child. However, we do also have a migrant population where our younger ones are stepping out of the country. And so we are losing a lot of talent to migration. And we are also losing, that communal fabric that has been the safety net for the country in the last, couple of decades.
So let's pick up, if we could, on this notion of highly informal and unregulated care. Could you just give us a view of what that actually looks like on the ground in communities that you work with in Nigeria?
Absolutely. So, informal and unregulated care simply looks like, the care workforce that doesn't know that they are, in fact, in the care business. So, this is, a helper, an auntie or a sister or a young child, where a family in the city needs someone, a caregiver, to care for their newborn, and so they have to bring in a child from from the village, from the town. Maybe their grandparent or their extended family members do have a child, whether a 10-year-old or an 11-year-old, that is available to support them. And then the other aspect of it is just families having to rely on word of mouth. So grabbing anyone from the streets to watch their children, whether it's, putting a call out on WhatsApp or telling a friend that they need a caregiver. And typically the way this works is agents available all around the country would say, yes, I can find you a caregiver. And they find somebody that, it basically doesn't have any background in caregiving, but needs an income or needs somewhere to stay. Because you have to also realize, like I said, we do have a very, very high population. We are at about 250 million people, and the unemployment rate is really, really high. I think it's about 70% for the youth in our country. So you're basically looking at a high number of youth that do not have access to high quality paying jobs, that are now venturing into caregiving as a last resort, if you will. So it is not really a career of choice. It is basically something that I get to do, that I can do while I'm waiting for a very good job. And that's okay. But the problem is that these folks actually do not have the background and the skill that is required, because fundamentally, as a society, we do not value caregiving. It's not seen as a skilled job. So families actually do expect that they are going to receive crappy care, but they are okay with it because, they get to pay so little for it. And they get to also exploit. So there's a lot of exploitation in this business here in Nigeria. Caregivers are being exploited, being underpaid, undervalued, disrespected. There's a high birth rate, but we do not have the infrastructure to support that.
So, I mean, one of the things that I think is consistent when we talk to people from countries that have rapidly, or continents that have rapidly growing populations, is that there's this struggle from the government to keep up. They have so much, right, that they're having to think about and to do. You think about both at the national level, the challenges of a rapidly growing population, unemployment you mentioned, right, youth unemployment in particular, and then at the local level, say Lagos or Abuja, those places, are rapidly growing too, right? And so at the level of, and one of course the big stories in Africa in the 21st century is rapid urbanization. So, at the local level too, there's a tremendous population explosion, strain on infrastructure, and so forth. So where does care fit in terms of the overall priorities of the governments, and what is happening, right, at the government level to better address the challenges that the care challenges that the rapidly growing population is presenting?
Absolutely. I think that the government is realizing, very quickly that this is unsustainable, that what we have is unsustainable. And we, my organization, Care in Africa, we have been very, very vocal around how unsustainable this is, and the need for the government to think of care as infrastructure. The same way we think about roads and power and electricity to catalyze our economy is the same way we need to be thinking about care, because we have a rapidly growing population. We have an economy that depends on this workforce. And let me paint a picture for you. Because 47% literally of our population is under the age of 15. right? And it means that our working population is actually at about 25-30%. And then we have the aging population, right? So that working population is feeling that squeeze because they have to take care of the 47%, and they also have to take care of the aging population. So in the US, we call this the sandwich generation, and we feel it here very strongly because it's so heavy, especially on the child care part of things. That is one. The other piece to this is that because we still sort of are in that communal, village type of framework as a society, that working population still also is responsible for the care of their aging adults. We do not have, to any extent, a serious nursing home in this country. So it means that these our aging population actually still live with the working population or still depend on the working population. So I hope I've been able to paint a picture for you in terms of the need, why we believe that the government needs to pay attention to care as an infrastructure, because it's actually limiting the productivity and the working capacity of that that workforce that is actually able to expand the economy, in the 21st century.
So, Blessing, when we hear aging population, I think we tend to think today about Europe, North America, some parts of Asia, like Japan, where the population is certainly aging rapidly and not being replaced by younger people. We tend not to think about Africa when we think about aging. Yet, as the AP reported last year, the number of people 60 and older over the last 15 years has ballooned by an estimated 50% in sub-Saharan Africa to 67 million people. And World Health Organization projects it ballooning even further to 163 million older people by 2050. So what is the story that you think we should be telling about population change, care, and aging in the African context?
Oh, absolutely. I think, when we, for example, here at Care in Africa, we said, our strategy for the next 5 years is to focus on childcare. And the reason is, of course, all of the things that I shared earlier, which is the fact that, about 47% of the population is under the age of 15. So it makes sense for us to focus on childcare. But then the trend that is going up is exactly what you mentioned, which is the aging population. And we're starting to see the strain on families because we do actually have a migrant population. I mentioned that earlier. So a lot of families are moving outside of the country, leaving their aging parents behind. And those folks are going to need some type of care. I think in the next 5, 10, 20 years, I think we are going to see a rapid increase in nursing homes for aging families, aging parents, because we do not have that infrastructure right now, and there is a growing need, and that is simply because families cannot sustain, the traditional setting of, oh, dad can be home or mom can be home, and there's no one to watch them. We're starting to see also this idea of mobile elder support. So families are requesting for adult caregivers to simply come in and keep their elderly ones company while they work. But yeah, I mean, I think from this end, we will see an increase in the need for elder care infrastructure in the next 5 to 20 years, for sure.
Yeah. So, I mean, I'm interested in this because, you've spoken already about sort of the communal nature of cultures across the African continent where care tends to happen in the home. And so one of the things that I'm thinking is that this is not just a sort of technical shift in terms of the need to provide care as the population ages, the population gets older, but it's really a cultural shift, right, in terms of how care is provided, where care is provided, the setting of it. And I'm wondering, is that primarily a reflection of people's mobility. They're not necessarily living at home with older family members? Or is there something else going on just in terms of shifting cultural norms around who is responsible for care?
I think there's a mixture of different things, and I think the biggest reason is honestly economic opportunity. We have the migrant population, we have the mobility issue, meaning that people are either moving from their village to Lagos, which is the urban area, which means their family members, their aging population or their aging parents is in the village and will need care at some point. When they move to an urban area like Lagos, they have to work, they have to support their immediate family, and they also have to support that aging population. So we're seeing that squeeze in terms of the infrastructure there. Another area where we are seeing the squeeze is that families actually do leave the country. So when they leave the country, in search of greener pastures, whether it's in Europe or in the Americas, they then need to support their family back home. They need to support that aging parent as well. They need to find a facility for them. In terms of the family that remain in the country, the problem that you're having is the lack of access to quality childcare. Because we do not have that infrastructure, it is not uncommon for families to actually keep the child at home, and it then becomes a problem for the mom, right? So dad will continue going to work, and now mom has to leave the labor force to care for children. There is no credibility in the child care that is currently available. It is not uncommon for children to be drugged in a child care center where they are maybe given a sleeping medication to sleep because, again, lack of training, lack of infrastructure. There's a whole bunch of reasons, irregulation, there's no real follow-up. So we're seeing a lot of lapses in the childcare infrastructure as a whole within the country. We are also seeing that because people do not have faith in the childcare system, they simply withhold the child at home. And so mom is not able to continue working. The family now have to rely on one income, and that just continues the cycle of, diminished economic opportunity.
Let's talk, if we could, about just housing design. I mean, again, like housing, infrastructure, urbanization. I mean, this is, as we had a conversation with Joseph Asunka from Afrobarometer about this, also on the podcast. And, the rapid urbanization of Africa has to be one of the biggest stories in the world in the 21st century. Some predictions that Lagos is going to have a population of 88 million people by the end of the century. So there's a huge opportunity, as I see it, for building the infrastructure that is needed, particularly in these rapidly growing cities. The care infrastructure, the housing infrastructure, but it has to be intentional, of course. So how are you thinking about the opportunity here? How are you all catalyzing people to think about the opportunity to build that infrastructure around urbanization or with urbanization? And then is there capacity on the government side to do that sort of intentional planning to support multi-generational housing, to support the development of nursing homes and other things that are necessary for families as people both age and as young children are born?
Absolutely. So first of all, let me tackle the opportunity piece. I think there's a huge opportunity. I actually think that Africa is positioned, and Nigeria specifically is positioned to actually lead the care revolution that we desperately need in the world. And the reason I say so is because we are literally starting from a blank slate. Right. I spent, like I said, 20 years in the US, and I know how much work we did to advocate for things like child tax credits. I don't even think that the US has a care policy. We still do not have, paid leave, as a federal mandate. So there's a whole bunch of, red tapes that we have in the US, which is actually making it difficult for us to pass something like a national care policy or put in place a national paid leave. And I think Africa is a different approach. I think that there is actually an opportunity for us to advocate for something like a national care policy here in Nigeria that essentially supports how we care for our newborn, how we care for children, how we care for our aging adults, how we care for persons with disability, how we care for children and adults with special needs. I think that we have an opportunity to do that. Another opportunity that we see is this is an opportunity to attract care investment into the country. We do have a population that is willing to pay for professional and quality care. They just don't have it. This is an opportunity to invest in things like nursing homes and elder care homes and childcare, centers that are actually advanced and can provide the infrastructure that families desperately need, the resources and the solutions that they need. So that is an opportunity that I think that a lot of investors are sitting on. And I think it requires us to actually understand the care economy on the continent. How do we quantify the care economy in Nigeria, for example, so that we are able to provide these numbers and these metrics to potential investors to understand the care landscape, the care opportunity, and invest appropriately in the care market here in Nigeria. That is a conversation we're currently having with the World Bank, with the IFC, to essentially ensure that investors, DFIs, understand the opportunity on the continent when it comes to care. In terms of the capacity of the government and other institutions, we've always said it that, for this to work, it needs to be that we properly redistribute the care load, right? We properly redistribute, this care issues that a country is currently facing. And we know that the care needs to be redistributed, to men specifically, because women are the ones shouldering majority of the care responsibilities right now. And that is, of course, tanking the economy because women are not able to invest their time in the economy because this is a time poverty issue. When women have to care for the children, there's no time to actually invest in growing their own capacity or contributing to the economy. So it means that we need to practice what we call shared responsibility, where men are able to pick up their own fair share when they're at home or when they're at work. It also means that we need to redistribute it to the market. We need to support the market. We do have a lot of founders, a lot of childcare entrepreneurs, a lot of elder care entrepreneurs that are excited about growing their business. But a lot of them can't even articulate the opportunity. And so many of them, because they do not understand that they are in the care economy, right? They've been unable to position their businesses for investment. We also, of course, need to train, right? We need to also educate the market. We need to educate the banks, the investors, the market on this opportunity so that entrepreneurs can have access to funding and can scale up care infrastructure for the country. We do need to redistribute it to institutions. What can employers do? If employers know that the working population is being strained by childcare and aging care on both sides, then can employers absorb some of the cost of caregiving? Can they provide childcare as a credit? Can they provide aging care? We already have companies that are invested in childcare in this country, and that is exciting. We have companies that have crèches on site. Various companies like Providus Bank, Access Bank, MTN, they are doing a lot of amazing work putting in place childcare crèches, but they can and should go further than that. And then, of course, lastly, we have the government. And this is, again, where everything still boils down to, can we have a national care policy? Can we include care workers in the National Labor Act so that care workers can actually see this job as a real professional job? They can be paid fairly and treated fairly. So those are some of the opportunities and the capacity that I think exists currently today in Nigeria.
And what would the pillars, in your ideal world, what would the pillars of that national care policy be?
I think in an ideal world, definitely looking at, a proper policy for aging care, child care, disability care, the care workforce, right? And then looking at care work in itself. Meaning all the work that is being done and who is responsible for it. Those are the pillars that we have been considering. And then, I think when we look at those pillars, it's not just the policy, it's also the investment, it's also the enabling environment, it's also the implementation, right? Because the policy can only work when we implement it properly, when we educate people, when we make it easier for the policy to be understood and implemented. So I think there's a lot of work ahead of us, but I think there's a huge appetite for separate. We currently had the International Day of Care, October 29th, and the Minister for Social Development here in Lagos did commit to a Lagos State care policy. So we are walking before we run, and I think that's a great step in the future of Nigeria and of Africa.
And I mean, I'd observe two things. One, it seems like there's an incredible investment opportunity for people who would be interested in getting into that and have the resources to get into it. And then secondly, I heard you say that Nigeria in particular is positioned to lead the global care revolution, which is something that frankly is exciting to me. I love to go to where the leading edge of the future is, and it sounds like you're making a strong case for the leading edge of the care revolution, the leading edge of the care future might actually be in Nigeria, which is really exciting to think about. Moving on, though, I mean, one of the more interesting stories, again, in the 21st century is the rapid growth of Christianity in Africa in particular. And I think, obviously, Nigeria is very much a multi-creedal state, a multi-creedal country, but Christianity is a significant presence in Nigeria as it is across Africa and rapidly growing. Certainly, there's a historical a case to be made that when Christianity spreads, it's generally accompanied by a robust care infrastructure. I'm less familiar with this as it relates to some of the other faiths, but hospitals, nurseries, other facilities, certainly, we know the history there, that these are often provided by faith communities. So what do you see as the role of religion and religious institutions in meeting Africa's care needs in this century? And maybe what are some examples of where religious institutions are already stepping up to sort of be part of this care revolution that you've described?
I wish I had great news. I honestly wish I had great news. I think I don't see it. I don't see it in Nigeria. I don't see religious institutions as a vehicle for care infrastructure. In fact, I think that the opposite is almost the case. And the reason I say that is because when you look at religious institutions set up in Nigeria, especially Christianity, there is a lot of exploitation. There is a lot of exploitations. Our pastors, you can Google it, are among the richest in the world. It's by design, right? It's essentially there's a lot of extraction of economic value from the population, from the congregation, and there's less investment in that population. One of the things that we have actively called for, and that is why when I talk about care, I talk about the need for the redistribution to institutions. And part of that institution is not just the workplace, it's also institutions like churches and mosques, faith-based organizations that already are, they're so close. They're so close to these individuals. It's not uncommon to see women especially spend so much time in churches and supporting, the infrastructure of the church, if you will. And so now you're looking at the situation where that same woman doesn't have access to childcare or doesn't even have access to support from that congregation or from that church simply because she cannot afford it. So we're seeing churches set up schools, but they do charge an arm and a leg for these schools. In terms of childcare infrastructure, we are seeing some churches, provide, things like Sunday school centers, right? So when it's time for church, you can actually just drop off your child at the Sunday school center or the childcare center, and you can attend service. And when service is over, you pick up your child. But really, nothing else happens outside of that, right? So I remember when in the US, I have 4 kids, and all my 4 kids were born in the US. And I would take my daughter to the Catholic pre-K school, and it was much more cheaper. It was much more cheaper because we went to the church and it was available to us, and we would, take our child to the preschool. But when you look at, churches, a lot of the churches do not have childcare daycare centers or preschools. And if they do, they charge an arm and a leg for it. And so I asked the question, I said, well, we have this infrastructure already set up. Like your church already have a Sunday school center, which is basically a
Right.
childcare center. Why is it that we are only utilizing it on Sunday from 9 to 12? Why isn't this available to your members as well as the community? And so we are now moving to this idea of redistributing care so that churches understand and faith-based organizations, mosque, understand their own responsibility for care. Educating the population around this redistribution is going to be key. And I hate to go the money route, but if my church is already collecting 10% of my tithe, I would really love for my church to support, my very core problem, which is childcare.
Yeah. Yeah. Fascinating. Let's talk now, if we could, about care work in Europe and North America and other places where the population is aging and it's not being replaced by a younger working age population. One of the things that is striking is that 1 in every 4 workers in the world, I think by the end of this century, if not the middle of the century, 1 in every 4 workers in the world will be an African. So the care workforce of the future, not just in the African context, on the African continent, but the care workforce broadly, just in terms of when you think about the sheer numbers of workers that are involved, the care workforce is going to be African. There is going to be a push-pull dynamic in some of these aging countries where there aren't people coming behind who can provide that care, and then there are going to be a lot of Africans who are going to be in the global workforce, and at the same time, as we've said, some high unemployment in particularly among youths in Africa that might pull them into the care workforce. So, what is a just future for African caregivers outside of Africa look like for you?
Oh my goodness. I love this question so much because this is a conversation we continue to have with a lot of international institutions. For example, the British High Commission, the Canadian High Commission, the US, around this idea of, the care workers. A lot of our care workers, again, extremely, informal. And so there is actually a global need for our workforce to be formalized and professionalized in order to properly serve the workforce, the global workforce of the future, right? So the world actually needs to invest in the professionalization of the African workforce if we are serious about how we care for our children and our aging population. So that is one. And I think, for example, when you look at Britain, I think it's very, very clear that they are already at the very short end of the stick. So we're seeing more and more Nigerians move, or more and more African move to the UK, to provide care. And we're going to start to see more and more of that, even in countries like the US and Canada. So I think that we are going to need to take the investment in the care economy in Africa seriously, in order for us to meet the demands of the future. I think that's one. And I think that in countries like Europe and North America, and around the world, we are really at a point where there needs to be, a serious understanding of the global exchange of care. I know there's a lot of conversation around immigrants and, and this path to citizenship and this path to permanent residency. But I think that we will be forced, as Americans, or as European, to really think about what that means for the care workforce that is required so that our working population can actually work.
So it's very interesting to hear you say that you're already speaking to the British High Commission, to the Canadian High Commission, to others. What are they doing though? Like what can the government of Canada be doing, in your view, to better support, just as an example, we're not trying to pick on Canada, but
Yeah, yeah.
what could the government of Canada be doing to better support this professionalization of a global care workforce, recognizing that it certainly is going to be in Canada's interest? But also, I mean, the thing that really worries me about this is that when you have the sort of dynamics around immigration plus the dynamics around what is historically low wage care work, there's some real opportunity and risk for injustice and exploitation that I think we also need to be ahead of. So it's not just how do we get the care that we need, but how do we get the care that those countries like Canada are going to need in the future in a way that is just and humane for that care workforce.
Absolutely. And I think this is why every country will need a national care policy. I think that we are at a point where the world has to take care seriously and understand that care is the engine that powers our economy. It's no longer work that we can expect women to provide. Because it used to, the only reason why we've gotten away with this for so long is because women have done this work and they've done it for free. But women are no longer doing this work. And a lot of women are pushing back. And in fact, we are seeing that the care economy have always existed, but it has existed as an underpaid, sector of the economy, an invisible economy that has powered the visible economy. And so one of the realization in the last decade has been that this is actually valuable work. And so we will need to formalize this properly. We will need to create the right policies. So, for example, what can Canada, Europe, and the US do is invest in care. It's very simple. They already come to Africa to invest in the agri business, in agriculture. They already come here to invest in roads. So it's the same thing. If you come to Africa, then you need to invest not just in malaria, not just in polio, not just in health, but you also need to invest in care because there is a direct correlation to the quality of care that your citizens will receive when this migration happen. And this migration will happen because there is going to be this natural pool, like you said, to pool these resources from Africa.
So I can imagine. Let me just say, like I'm pretty familiar with the care conversation in the United States, and I'm not hearing any child care or elder care advocates in the United States advocating for more investment in care from the private sector or from the public sector outside of the United States. And I think that's probably because they probably believe that we have big enough problems here in the United States with our care sector that we don't need to be investing in the care sector in other parts of the world. But it strikes me as a very interesting and frankly exciting possibility, right? To think about a global care economy, a global care infrastructure, and building something globally in which we can really embed solidarity, justice, mutuality, humanity that's going to benefit the low-wage care worker here in the United States and also benefit the care workers in Nigeria and the future population, future African workforce population, or the future worker population of the world, right, which is going to be
Yeah,
largely
absolutely.
African, at a time when we desperately are going to need more care workers, particularly for the aging populations of Europe and North America.
Absolutely. And I think the reason that they are not bringing it up is because they're in denial. They're in denial. They don't think that we need immigrants to take care of our aging population. But then the reality is that when COVID hit, we saw it in plain sight that, in fact, majority do have, did employ immigrants, and with the continued crackdown on immigration, I think we're going to see more. We're going to see the cost of care go up. And I think that our advocates are not being truthful about where care is actually coming from in America. Because when you look at the domestic workforce in America, we have a high number of Mexicans, we have a high number of Latinas, we have a high number of African population that have migrated, some legally, some illegally, but have migrated to the country to provide quality care. So I think we need to put a mirror up and be truthful around one, the high cost of care and the fact that we're going to continue to see this cost go up in an economic environment that has actually become increasingly tougher. Families are going to have to make the decision for women to drop out of the workforce. And we're already seeing the numbers. Women, dropped out of the workforce significantly in the last half of the year of 2025. Majority of those women were women leaders. And in fact, the recent report by Lean In said women are no longer ambitious. Women in America no longer want to advance in their careers. And, when you dig down into the data, it's actually because of their caregiving responsibilities. It has nothing to do with their ambition level or their qualifications or the skill sets. It really has to do with the fact that these women do not have access to affordable care.
We could probably do a whole episode on this topic because it seems really, really sticky to me. And I point well taken about the advocates here in the United States and other places needing to put a mirror up to themselves and sort of come to a sort of truthful conclusion that we already depend on immigrants. We're going to depend on immigrants even more and more in the future, and that it's in our best interest to think about investment in the care economies and the care workforce in other places. I'm still not totally sure who is setting the table for that conversation. Maybe it's Caring Africa. Maybe Caring Africa and Capita should be doing it together. And B, where we need to be, concretely, where we need to be making the investments today to support the development of a care infrastructure, global care workforce and global care infrastructure on which we're all going to rely in the next
Absolutely.
25, 50, 75 years.
Correct. Correct. I think there's a lot of work to be done. And I think that work requires data, it requires policy, it requires quantifying, the economy, the care economy itself. It requires also thinking about, what happens when we do not care. And I think that it needs that, we need to share that in numbers because a lot of, so many times when we talk about care, it's so sentimental. It's like, oh, just support women and companies. When you do this, you increase your productivity. There's a whole bunch of, I'm no longer interested in that conversation because the real conversation that we need to be having is the fact that you and I cannot continue our work if we cannot rely on the underpaid labor of our partners.
Yeah.
That is really it. Or the unpaid labor of our partners. It just means that my husband needs to quit his job and your wife needs to quit his job and we take advantage of them in order to continue working.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think the other thing that we haven't talked at all about, which is very relevant, is the impact of climate shocks, right? And the need to adapt. It's driving migration. It's driving poor health outcomes for children, right? You think about 90% of the global disease burden of climate change is borne by children under the age of 5, which means, there are more days that caregivers are going to have to spend out of work to take care of a sick child. There's going to be more internal displacement and so forth. And and that is also part of the broader context, right? In addition to the demographic realities that we've already discussed. So, is climate and climate change sort of factoring into how you all are thinking about care and caregiving across the continent?
100%. When it comes to Africa, climate change is real for us. Families are being displaced. Women especially bear the most brunt because they have to think about how to provide food, how to provide shelter for their children. The elderly ones are immediately in need of quality care due to climate change. And women, again, have to be the one to shoulder the burden of this care. This is something that we are constantly thinking about when we speak to donors, when we speak to government agencies, when we speak to institutions like the World Bank, to say we need to really think about these things as a holistic, opportunity. Care, when we look at how we think about care, think about not just the aging care, but like you have just even mentioned, it almost seems like we need to put in climate care as part of a care policy so that it's really clear how we absorb the impact of climate change into the care ecosystem as well.
Yeah. Fascinating. Two last questions for you. The first is who is doing exceptional work besides Caring Africa, perhaps quietly, on caregiving in Africa, across Africa, who we should be paying attention to?
I have to just even, I think that because care is, it's a very nascent, I think I would think about actually a care provider. And one of them is the Baby Lounge. Another is the
Love
Nanny.
that name.
I know. Another is the Nanny Academy. And the reason I bring these two up is because they provide two different, distinct support to families. Nanny Academy, for example, provides professional caregivers. So they actually have an institute that trains caregivers, and they do export some of those caregivers to Canada, for example. So that is one to pay attention to. Another one is the Baby Lounge. They have been in service for 20 years here in Nigeria, providing high quality childcare. They provide employer sponsored childcare, they provide in-home childcare, they provide on-demand event childcare. They support families after having a baby. So there's a whole bunch of, I call them my care innovators. And because they've constantly innovated around care in Nigeria and across the continent. They are constantly thinking about what is the pain point for families and for institutions, and how can we very quickly, solve for care. So those are the two people that I'll put forward as,
Great.
people that I think are doing remarkable work.
Nice. And what is one project that you have dreamed of but haven't started yet?
Oh my goodness. I have dreamt of what I call the Care Foundry, which is basically an investment vehicle and an innovation hub for care investments in Africa. So basically, an opportunity for us to, support care entrepreneurs, startup founders that are really innovating, right? Coming up with serious innovation around care, and we can support them with funding, with technical assistance, with operational excellence, all the tools, all the things that they need to build a proper care solution for families.
Great. Blessing Adesiyan, thank you so much for joining us on Per Capita.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.